Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Hayden Newberry Fishing. We are in the back of the camper again tonight. Just a reminder, we are doing a giveaway at 2,000 subscribers, so subscribe to the channel to get in on that. It'll either be a jig, a crankbait, or both, not sure yet. And then also the episodes of Storytime, send in your tournament stories to h.newberryfishing@gmail.com. I am going to give away a V&M swim jig for the first giveaway, and I might throw in a crankbait, or after that we might do crankbaits and jigs, I'm not sure, but at the very least on the first one, if I use your story, I'll send you a free swim jig. And pretty much in those stories, if you're not familiar with the episode, I did the first one this past week. Pretty much I'm telling tournament stories, getting you guys' opinion on them, giving my opinion on them. I'm not going to use any names in the ones you guys send in, so if you're worried about people bashing you or bashing the people in the story, don't worry about it. We're just telling stories so that everybody can kind of hear the ideas and what's done wrong, what's done right, all that. So tonight we're going to talk about line size. I think it's a big deal. I thought I'd give out at least my opinion on how I choose line size, what I think is appropriate for each situation, and I keep it pretty simple. So when I'm choosing line size, a lot of it has to do initially if I'm using a moving bait, or if I'm like dragging a jig using a drop shot, shade head, something that they a lot of times will look at for a little bit longer. But I feel like a lot of people, all they're thinking about is it holding still, moving, are they pressured? But you got to remember that a moving bait, they're not really gonna, I guess, look at your line as much. There are things to consider, which I'll get to that. But if you're fishing open water situation, even if the water's clear, line size is not that big of a deal, guys. I personally, I will throw about as big as I can get away with in open water if it's a moving bait. The only thing I'm going to take into consideration is how deep I'm fishing and if it's going to affect the action of it. So, like in crystal clear, like smallmouth water, if I'm throwing like a marabou jig, I'm always going to use like 10-pound line or heavier, because that allows me to swim it at the depth that I want to, and it's heavy enough that I don't have to worry too much, and you can go much bigger than that. They're not getting a look at the line. Kind of something that opened that up to me initially was fishing an A-rig. You look at that thing, it's a moving bait. It's got wires on it. And at that point, I was always like, oh, with moving baits, the line size might matter. But I mean, the proofs in what happens. I mean, you throw these baits that have these massive wires on them, like spinner baits, and it doesn't seem to bother them too much. But anyway, that's something I use to consider with moving baits. Just initially with line size, I personally don't think that you have to look into it too much. Really, swimming depth for crankbaits, you have to think about line size for that. You can inhibit how deep it's going to go if you go too big. But moving baits, pretty much what I'm getting to is that you don't have to be too much of a stickler on there. You can go as big, or you can go small, but I like to go on the bigger sizes for moving baits. But to get to the next thing, where I think line size is a very big deal, and where I actually give it the most consideration, is if you're fishing brush piles. And here's why. And it can be translated into other things also. But brush piles, a lot of times you got to think about what you're doing. You're not, or for most of the time, you're not just dropping it. About to knock my hat off there. You're not just dropping it right in the middle of the brush pile. You're casting over the brush. So I'm gonna turn sideways to explain this to you guys that are actually watching it. Bait lands back here, brush pile's right here. Say my arm's the line. Look at where the line is. If your bait lands right back here, boat's right behind it. So say you're using 20-pound test. Where is that line right now? Those fish are sitting on top of that brush pile. You just hit them with it. And as you're dragging it through the fish that are sitting right here, even if it's on the side of it. For however long you're bringing that bait up to the brush pile, that line is going like this, just wrecking it. So you got to really, really take that into consideration. That's why a lot of times it's good to fish the edges of the brush pile. You don't want to go Hail Mary it right over the center of the brush pile because you are going to disturb it. Whether you, it's not, and that's a lot of people when they're fishing it, they'll bring it up and they think that when they're disturbing it's when the bait actually gets into the brush pile. A lot of times you've already spooked the fish and your bait is still 20 feet on the other side of it because this random line just dropped down and hit them on the head and then they felt it jerking across them. So big thing to consider when it comes to line size. That's a lot. That's why I think for me personally, I think drop shots are extremely effective when you're fishing big brush piles and things like that. And I'll use actually quite a bit lighter line in brush piles because of that reason, because they're really getting a good look at it. I think brush piles are one of the places that it feels nice to use bigger line in brush piles because there's so much that can go wrong, but then there's so many easy ways to spook a fish in a brush pile. But also something to consider on points, there's a lot of depth changes if you're casting over a point using too heavy a line. Same thing. These are the situations where personally I think line matters the most, and I'll actually go with a smaller line if I think that my line is going to be in the fish's face before they see my bait. So that's pretty much what I'm getting to is that my decision on line size a lot of times is really based on if they're going to see my line before they see my bait. Dirty water is a big thing. You can always upsize that, and that's what I mean. I'm going to hit the technical parts of it. Line size, really, like dirty water, things like that. Just you do what feels good in that. You obviously don't go throw an 8-pound line when the water's mud. I mean, you can go about as big as you want in some really, really dirty water. But yeah, something to really consider is if the fish is going to be exposed to seeing your line or possibly hitting a fish with your line on the way to getting to them. And that's even with swimming baits. If you've got a school of fish sitting here, you have to really consider if they're going to have their line or a line drugged through their face before the bait actually gets to them. Another thing to consider that I feel like is missed sometimes is a lot of people like to use braid on all their top waters. So that's kind of the next thing I'm going to get to with line size is that don't be afraid to use mono with your top waters either, especially even if you're fishing around cover. You're better off, in my opinion, and this is what I've felt like I see work a lot of the time, is that even if I'm fishing shallow grass and things like that, I'm always taking into consideration if those fish are going to be seeing my line before they see my bait. If you're fishing a top-water over a fish and you're using 50-pound braid and that water is too clear, you have to realize that huge braided line sitting on top of the water is making ripples, it's making wakes, and those are those things those fish can key on. If they've had 100 frogs drug over the top of them that day on that really popular lake, eventually they're going to start getting spooked by that line being over the top of them. Don't be afraid to use a big monofilament. I say mono because it actually floats. You don't want to use fluorocarbon. I will use fluorocarbon a lot of times with my buzz baits, because especially in buzz baits and prop baits, because in that water where I'm not letting it set, where I'm actually bringing it through, a lot of those fish are exposed to your line well before they see your bait. So you don't want a really big, thick, braided line being drug over the top of them for 30 seconds before all of a sudden the bait comes along. They're going to be gone, especially if they're spooky. So always something to consider there. I am absolutely not afraid. I've caught quite a few fish with a frog on like monofilament, or if I can get away with it in really clear water situations, I've also fished it on fluorocarbon. People think that's crazy. Sometimes I personally don't. If it catches the fish, it catches the fish. And I've had times when I didn't really want to tie on something because I had these setups in my boat, and I stuck a frog on some fluorocarbon, and people want to go by the book. You absolutely don't have to. Line size is totally a just look at the situation, look and see if you think it is actually affecting the fish, and then try it. And a lot of times you'll be surprised that with non-traditional setups that that you can switch to a different line and it works perfectly fine. So really, I guess what I'm getting to with my easy-ish standard that I go by when it comes to line size is that if you think that the fish is actually seeing your line before your bait, that is when you need to worry about line size. Or if it's affecting the action. If the fish is not seeing your line size before they see your bait, then you most of the time don't have to worry about it. They're looking over here at your hand, your line's over here, they don't care. If you can get them to see this first, you're fine. If they see this first and then they're looking over here and then your bait comes here, you're gonna get them spooky and they're not gonna close in and do what you want them to. Always something to consider. Hope it helps you guys out. Thanks for watching.